My name is John Denny. Those of you who know me know I'm a research professor at the Strategic Studies Institute here at the U.S. Army War College. I'd like to welcome all of you here in the room. And thank you for attending, and welcome our virtual audience also. We are broadcasting this to the seminar rooms in Root Hall here, as well as to the internet. And we would invite virtual audience participation. I'll be monitoring, with the help of my trusty internet-enabled smartphone, I'll be monitoring the hashtag SSI events. And so if you have questions out there in the seminar rooms or in the broader internet, please tweet those questions to hashtag SSI events. Today, I am honored to welcome back to the War College my friend, Dr. Sven Biskup. Sven is the director of the Europe in the World program at the Egmont Institute. That's the Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels, Belgium. He's also a professor of international relations at the University of Ghent. Sven is a prolific author. He writes frequently on European security, European strategy issues. He's the author, most recently, of this book, Peace Without Money, War Without Americans, Can European Strategy Cope? Now, we've invited Sven here today to talk to us about the EU in the world, the EU strategy. This, as many of you know, is a rather fraught time in transatlantic relations. Fundamental questions have been raised by many about the role of the EU, the impact of Brexit, how that might be a positive thing perceived by some, and whether it may have a centrifugal impact on other countries in Europe. Questions have been raised about the utility of NATO, as well as about the EU, and about the American role in European security. This has led to, I think it's fair to say, a degree of nervousness on the part of many of American allies in Europe. We've heard in recent weeks folks like Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, Secretary of State Tillerson, most recently Vice President Pence this past weekend at the Munich Security Conference, saying the right things, right? For those of us that believe that the EU-US relationship is critical to not simply European transatlantic security, but to global stability. They've been saying things that have been reassuring, I think, to European ears. The question is whether or not that's really enough, and whether our European allies are indeed reassured by that, whether our adversaries are deterred by those comments. And of course, this raises questions about how the EU is to respond to this new situation, the new tone being set by Washington. And so Sven is uniquely positioned, given his expertise and his knowledge and what he's written about, to comment on the EU response and whether and how the EU is positioned to be indeed an autonomous actor in the world today. And so we've asked Sven to talk to us about those topics. We'll hear from Sven for a few minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A with you all, as well as those hopefully in our virtual audience. So without further ado, Sven, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Denny, John. First of all, for giving me the opportunity to speak here again. It's a different audience than my usual Brussels-based audience, and it's always good to get. You have the Washington Beltway, we have the Brussels bubble, and it's important to reach out of those places from time to time. Indeed, while I've been here, everybody from Washington has been going to Brussels, and starting with Secretary Mattis. And as you said, John, Secretary Mattis, the Vice President, they said the right things, although we also noticed that Mattis said that if European allies would not pay up, then the US would consider having to moderate its contribution to NATO. But I guess in Europe we're happy that there is at least something that this administration wants to be moderate about. So we consider that also as a positive thing. I mean, more seriously, I do think all the comments were very well received on the European side. People are somewhat more at ease, but not entirely so. I think for two reasons. One, very stark positions were taken by the president-elect and still even by the president. Many of those have now been nuanced, some even overturned. I'm thinking about the statements on the one China principle. But you can say, well, if they've been changed once, maybe they can be changed again. And two, I think a lot of us still question, as people here, I suppose, what exactly is the relationship between the different players in the US system, and whether if the Vice President or the Secretary of Defense says something, to which extent that really commits the government and the President. That is for us not yet entirely clear at this stage. But I would say, so far so good. There are now some statements that we can work with. But even a lot of the more dramatic seeming US positions have been nuanced now. The fact in itself that Europeans were so extremely worried about all of these statements that I think should give us pause to think. I mean us in Europe. The fact that we seem to be so utterly dependent on what the US president does or doesn't do means that we have no strategic autonomy at all. And so even if some of the events that we fear the most, I'm thinking of very far-reaching protectionism, provoking a trade war. I'm thinking of ending the nuclear deal with Iran, for example. I'm thinking of a too confrontational course towards China. Even if those things do not come to pass, the fact that we are so dependent on the US should mean that Europeans have to strive to achieve more strategic autonomy. Now, presciently, Federica Mogherini, the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, wrote that into the new EU global strategy, which was adopted in June of last year, which says that strategic autonomy should be the objective. But we're not behaving like it. It always irritates me that when I look at the European political scene, we're all waiting for the president's newest tweet, then everybody is shocked and criticizes him, and then we wait for the next tweet for us to be shocked again. So we need to be a lot more proactive, and this mostly means, I think, proactive on the diplomatic front. I'm not talking about moving divisions and carrier groups around, especially because there are no carrier groups, or not too many, but taking to the diplomatic stage. I want to touch on three sets of issues briefly before we debate. I think the first is our relations, or where does Europe position itself in the relations between the great powers, the US, China, Russia, and the European Union, which I think could be a great power if it wanted to. Clearly, I mean, we expect this administration to be a lot more confrontational than the previous one vis-à-vis China, even though the president has confirmed US adherence to the One China principle. But there have also been statements about the fish islands, Senkaku Islands, that they would be covered by the alliance with Japan, for example. We do expect a military buildup, and we do expect military pressure to confront China in the South China Sea. And there is the potential economic fallout of a much more protectionist course. Europe will not follow in this confrontational course. Nobody in Brussels thinks of China as a threat, but just like that. We think of China as a really important trade partner, sometimes a difficult trade partner, when a partner with sometimes strange behavior that we don't fully understand, seen from Brussels, such as its assertiveness in the South China Sea, but we don't consider it to be a threat against Europe. And I think now there is an opportunity for us to deepen our relations with China, which could, in the end, benefit everybody. There was a very interesting statement by the Trade Commissioner of the EU, Cecilia Malmström, who said something along the lines of, the EU stands ready to fight alongside China against protectionism. But China also needs to reform itself. We are trying to negotiate a bilateral investment treaty, but the Chinese market is very close to investment. So by making that linkage, we're actually that would be really strategic use of our trade instruments, because China is nervous now. It's very export dependent. It's very worried about a potential trade war. So they might be willing to concede something. At the same time, though, if the Chinese market is too closed, ours is too open. Anybody in Europe can buy anything. The Russians, the Chinese, and perhaps this is our chance to say, let's put a certain cap on foreign ownership of critical infrastructure, and then we can have a really equitable investment treaty with the Chinese. Because now, I mean, the moment Russia buys a TV station or a newspaper in Bulgaria, for example, will they still be giving us the news, or will they be presenting alternative facts, to use a fashionable term? The moment China has bought a port, like in Piraeus in Greece, as a NATO official said to me, can we be sure that in a crisis scenario, that port will be available to us to ship in military reinforcements? You don't know, so it's something we could think about. At the same time, I think Europe, the EU now has a great chance to further its trade agenda not just with China, but in the whole of Asia. And again, with a lot of foresight, the EU Global Strategy of June last year says exactly that we need to conclude more free trade agreements, specifically in Asia. Because the one thing that to me is difficult to understand is why the president pulled out of TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been the economic underpinning of his China strategy, because countries that are trying to keep some distance from China, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, they were looking to this to allow being sucked completely into China's orbit. If you take this away, you create an economic vacuum which China will be very eager to fill. The EU's projected free trade agreements, therefore, immediately gain a lot more strategic importance because they will be the only big FTAs on offer, presumably. That's something that we have to realize then in Europe, that they are strategically important and we have to pursue them with a lot more vigor, but also make sure that we don't handicap ourselves by a too complex decision making. You might have seen how the decision making on the free trade agreement with Canada, CETA, was complicated in the end, and we have to find ways to get around that. If I'm thinking very creatively, we could also link our relations with China to those with Russia. In Henry Kissinger's latest book, World Order, he says, as long as we're closer to the US and to Russia and to China than they are among themselves, we're good. I mean, of course, that's reflecting his own big success of the 70s, but I think he's still right, and it applies perhaps even more to Europe than to the US, since Russia is our direct neighbor. The Chinese big thing is, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. This is massive investment in infrastructure, specifically in a land route that goes through Central Asia and through Russia to Europe. Now, we don't need that trade route in Europe, right? We have a perfectly good maritime trade route to China. And I was having lunch with a Chinese diplomat the other day, rather with two Chinese diplomats, because they're not allowed to have lunch alone with you. And they said, Belt and Road is not about charity. And I was thinking, well, no, it's not about charity. There's nothing really in for it for Europe. We have trains that come in Europe full of Chinese goods, and they go back empty. Could we not say to the Chinese, this land route is nice and we're willing to play, but we can't really, because we can't be sure that Russia will not interrupt it. So if this will become really important, but it passes through Russia, why would we do that? This is your problem, China, not ours, because you want it. This is easy for me to say, I know that as an academic, but I think this is a sort of more strategic thinking about our trade policy that we should get going in Europe. Thinking more in terms of geoeconomics, to use an expensive term. And a lot of the competence here lies with the EU already, so we don't need any big innovations for it. It's a matter of using the instruments and the tools that we have in a much more proactive way. Of course, I'm not suggesting that we sort of put all our eggs in the China basket now. We know that China is an authoritarian regime. Obviously, our wish is for the transatlantic alliance to remain the cornerstone of our grand strategy, but I think in a mature alliance, you should allow room for flexibility. We know that on some topics, we will likely be closer to the Chinese position than to the US position. Thinking also about climate change, for example. In a mature alliance, it should be possible to flexibly work with other partners on specific topics without putting the long-term strategic partnership in danger. There was a lot of worry also in Europe about, because we felt that the Trump administration would be willing to make a deal with Russia, with Vladimir Putin, at any cost. Those fears have, I think, also been assuaged by the statements that we heard now from the Vice President specifically. Of course, the fact in itself that we would like a deal with Russia, that's logical. And President Obama also wanted to make a deal with Russia, only didn't work. But we don't want to deal with Russia at any price. To conclude a deal with Russia on Syria, I don't think that demands a price, because Russia has basically reached its war aim in Syria. The Assad government will stay in place and its interest will therefore be guaranteed. And now they want to consolidate their gains, so they need the war to end, so you don't need to pay them too much for that. So I think in Europe we're very attached to the Minsk agreement, and though People know, though they won't say it on the record, that the Crimea will not revert to Ukraine, but at least eastern Ukraine, mainland Ukraine, should be restored to the full control of the government in Kiev. Are we going to invite Ukraine to join NATO or the EU? Well, please no. Nobody in Brussels really wants that. If that is a precondition to make that official, to conclude a deal, I wouldn't be against that person. So I think there is some leeway to negotiate, but not at any price. So we definitely have to keep talking with Russia at the same time, but it takes two to tango, obviously. Second topic I wanted to touch is Europe's immediate neighborhood. That's a neighborhood in turmoil, of course, and for the moment it is not clear to me what will be the United States' future security engagement in our neighborhood. We have already seen it diminish to some extent. I don't mean in the context of Article 5 vis-à-vis Russia, but in the context of crisis management, and because of the pivot to Asia, which I expect we will see continue, it seems logical to me that there is a rightful US expectation that Europeans assume more of the burden themselves for security in what is our backyard. This means a couple of things. It seems to me that Europe needs to think a lot more about what is the desired end state they would like to see in the Middle East. Quite a few European countries take part in a coalition against ISIS that is commanded by the United States. But beyond the fact that ISIS needs to be destroyed, there is no view. What is our desired end state for Syria? What is our desired end state for Iraq? Who are the actors that we think are worthy of our support, including our military support? Because you're not going to go back to a nice and beautifully unified Syria and even Iraq, I think. You're going to go back to a patchwork with different kinds of actors in control of different bits of territory. Are there those among them who we will support, have to support or not? How does that fit with Turkey and its position in the alliance, for example? Europe is changing its strategy for its own neighborhood, and it has basically stepped away from active democratization. The best thing to happen to our neighbors would be if they would all be well-governed democratic states, but they aren't, and we can't turn them into democracies. That's unfortunate, but it's a fact, right? It would be great if Egypt were to be a democracy, but we're not going to do it. So let's also not pretend it. I accept that fact. But what do we offer them? The new buzzword in Brussels is now resilience. We're going to increase the resilience of our neighbors. But I find that a rather defensive concept. What does it mean to be resilient? It means that you can take a hit in the face, and someone will hit you in the face because we're not going to prevent him from doing that. But once you've been hit, we're going to help you get back up on your feet again. Keep resilient and carry on. I'm not sure that's a very motivating concept vis-à-vis our neighbors. In more old-fashioned jargon, you could say, well, that's a buffer state. A state that can take a hit so that the problem doesn't reach you, that's a buffer state. That sounds a bit less EU-like already, doesn't it? Are we going to say to our neighbors, well, congratulations. You've just been selected as the EU's newest buffer state. Comes with a little subsidy. I'm not sure it's a winner. So I think on two levels we need something else. One, I think what Europe can really sell, a much more winning concept, is equality. The basic cause of instability in our neighborhood is inequality within these countries in economic terms, but also in security terms. In many countries, the regime only protects its own security, not those of its citizens. And in political terms, of course, inequality before the law and no political participation. So in the long term, even with authoritarian regimes, there are things that we can do in the economic sphere, in the sphere of human rights, in the sphere of security, to reduce inequalities in countries, and that in the end benefits us. And sovereignty. We're not looking for client states, like some of the others are, like the Russians are, for example. We're looking for partners. So I think equality and sovereignty could be a much more winning concept, and it's closely linked to what Europe itself is all about. It's a model of society based on equality, on the egalitarian aspiration. But a lot of our neighbors currently, they are fighting for survival. Think of Ukraine, think of Iraq, think of the opposition in Syria. So what they want for the moment is security guarantees. They want military support, and not just me coming to give a lecture, but real military support. And that's a question that I ask myself. Even if Europe says, okay, it's impossible to democratize our neighbors, but what happens where there are democracies and they are threatened? from the outside, like in Ukraine, or from the inside, like in Turkey? Should it not be up to us to act as the guarantor, the security guarantor of the democracies or the countries that are moving towards democracy in our neighborhood? That's a pretty tall order, but I think we need to ask the question. Think of Tunisia. In Brussels, we like to hold up Tunisia as the one success story that came out of the Arab Spring, but it's still pretty fragile. What happens if tomorrow there's a major security issue in Tunisia and the government asks Europe for military help to quell an armed rebellion? Would we do that, or would we not? Who would be part of that? So I think in our neighborhood, it seems to me that we have to count on more limited US engagement in certain types of crisis, certainly in the first instance. So we have to step up ourselves, and it means that we need to think up front, well, how do we see our role and what are we willing to do? Final point, briefly on defense. In a way, of course, well, we all noted during the campaign and as President-elect when Donald Trump said that NATO is obsolete, and in a way he's right, of course. An alliance whose credibility rests almost entirely on one ally is obsolete. You can't argue with that. If you think the US out of NATO for a second, hypothetically, what you've got left looks very much like the Belgian army of 1940. It was big, it's massive. We mobilized 600,000 troops in 1940, but little or no modern equipment, not enough by far, and no unified leadership and no clear sense of purpose. So the only thing we've got going for is that the Russians are in a much worse shape, right? And, the EU 28 have about 1.5 million people in uniform. That's more than the US actually, and it's twice the number that the Russians have in uniform. And the tip of the Russian spear is quite sharp, but I think the shaft is a bit moldy. But of course the Russians are investing, and Europeans, our defense budgets are increasing, but not fast enough. What I don't think though is that it's very helpful to focus on the fetish of the 2%. The one reason, because it's highly unlikely that all of Europe will reach that, to spend 2% on defense. For quite a few countries that means doubling the defense budget, and no, it ain't gonna happen. It might also not be necessary. Secondly, the problem is that we have, of course, if I count EU countries, 28 sets of armed forces, and a lot of duplication between them. So what we have, the defense budget we have now, a lot of it is just wasted, basically. Wasted because some of us maintain capabilities that are really not capabilities at all, can't be used for anything, but also because there's a huge overhead, because 28 states means 28 defense establishments, 28 staffs, 28 war colleges, etc., etc. So if you pour in more money in a wasteful structure, you just waste more money. So if you do not at the same time cut away the dead wood, there's no point, I think, in increasing defense spending. Plus, there are some countries who reach 2%, but those are not necessarily the ones who do something with their armed forces. There's no point in spending a lot of money if you're unwilling to deploy your forces. So what I think we should do is make a major leap towards defense integration in Europe. Not just defense cooperation, making sure that we're interoperable with each other, but real defense integration that would allow you to merge or specialize in terms of all the support structures, all the support functions that we need. And as a result of that, you would free up money to invest in research and technology and in capabilities, but also to maintain sizable, significant maneuver units that can actually be deployed. You can do that in different frameworks. You can do that through NATO and as a framework nations concept, but I noticed that the way it's being used now, it's been drifting away from how it was originally perceived as a format to do exactly this. Now it's used more to generate rotations for the pre-positioned forces in Eastern Europe. Or you can do it through the EU, where there is an instrument in the treaty called Permanent Structured Cooperation, which also envisages exactly that. It's being debated now since the summer of last year, but member states in Europe have still to decide whether they actually want to do it. Germany especially is pushing for it. There have been various Franco-German proposals, but now when push comes to shove, the French seem relatively reluctant to actually go for it. Yet this is the only way forward, I think, for Europeans. If you want those 28 nations to spend their defense money in the most effective way, in the most useful way, you have to integrate it. You have to cut out of our arsenals the useless stuff, and we have to spend on what we really need, not on what gives you prestige, not on what your own defense industry happens to produce, but on what we really need, on the priorities that both the EU and NATO have identified. And the European Commission, a bit counterintuitively perhaps, could actually be the most promising actor in this, because the Commission has discovered defense as a topic and is moving into this area. And it's proposed two things. One is more or less a done deal. There will be EU money for defense research. In the next budgetary period, that means after 2020, 500 million a year. I know that it's not much compared to what the US spends on defense research, but it's 500 million more than what we had. And you can use it to incentivize member states to also spend more on defense research. If you say, you put €1 into a useful project, well, we can double it out of our 500 million. So that's more or less decided upon. The other thing that the Commission has proposed is to set up a European defense fund of 5 billion a year for actual investment in capabilities. This is still being debated, how the fund would be filled. But the ideal thing would be if you could say, look, half of it comes from the EU budget, and then again you can say to member states, well, if you put €1 into a capability project that meets the priority shortfalls, and it's a collective project with other member states, then your euro can be doubled with a euro from the Commission, and then you could get something going. And you could link this to this tool of permanent structured cooperation. You could say to member states, if you want to enter into this new mechanism, well, the criterion, the entry fee is that you put money into the defense fund. This is all highly political, highly difficult, so the debate is ongoing. And to wrap it up, decisions were expected for March. There will be a European Council in March where we'll also commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Rome Treaty, the beginning of the European integration process. But March is, of course, very close, very nearby. As you know, in France, they're already in election mood. And then afterwards, we'll have the German elections. So my feeling is rather that in March it will be important to make sure that the process keeps going, and that then in the second half of the year, when we've had both the French and the German elections, we can make some actual decisions. So I'm a Belgian. I have to be optimistic about European integration, because absent European integration, we sort of tend to be caught in the crossfire always, historically speaking. A lot is moving, including on topics which had been sort of deadlocked for some time already. It doesn't mean that all my wishes will be fulfilled, but then again, I have to have something to keep fighting on, and I have a mortgage to pay. So thank you for your attention, and look forward to your views and ideas on this.
Sven, thank you for your comments and for your insights. It's quite a thing. I don't think anybody could have foreseen 6 months ago that we would be discussing, or you would be discussing, how the EU and China may be triangulating geoeconomically vis-a-vis the United States. So it's quite a commentary on where the state of not simply international relations, but transatlantic relations specifically. Let me ask you, getting to that first of the three topics that you covered, do you think the EU and its leading member states are ready to take on the challenge, are ready to implement or to fulfill the vision spelled out in the 2016 strategy with regard to strategic autonomy? Or do you think that, from what you are perceiving now in Europe, that really the timing is frankly very bad for that, given the elections coming up in the Netherlands in March, France coming up later in the spring, Germany later this year, as well as the beginning of Brexit negotiations, and more of what I've called half in jest, you're EU navel gazing, right? In internal focus is really what I mean, versus this sort of external focus, getting at some of the things you spoke of with regard to managing geo-economic relations. You think Europe's ready for that right now?
I don't think Brexit specifically will have such a big impact on it, because it will have on the UK. And what I'm very afraid of is that the whole UK apparatus will be absorbed by Brexit negotiations, and that UK will not be able to play a strong leading role in diplomacy or in defense. In fact, we've already seen that ever since they had first a referendum on Scottish independence and the EU referendum. We've seen a lot less British proactiveness than before. But on the EU side, the EU is a big thing, and people have been assigned who will deal with this, and that leaves enough bandwidth, I think, to deal with the rest. But yes, it's specifically the elections in Germany and France that create sort of the middle of the year where it will be difficult to take any far-reaching decisions. My feeling is that the EU institutions, the Commission, that they are ready, and especially because a lot of this is about trade, which means that the Commission is in the driver's seat when it comes to trade. But they do need, of course, the agreement of the member states to move ahead. They can initiate, they can launch, they can propose, but then it needs the capitals to go along. So, given the remarks by the Trade Commissioner, it seems that they are preparing something, but it's not clear to me whether they are really prepared to see trade as part of a bigger grand strategy. The global strategy says that that's the first time it does say that we should use trade in that way, because in the past we didn't really do it. We have DG Trade that has its own agenda, which seemed to be sometimes entirely separate from the more political foreign policy agenda. So I think that is something that we need to try and drive that culture. We actually will have a series of workshops, our institute, together with the European Policy Center, precisely on this idea of geoeconomics.
Well, why don't we throw this out to the audience here? Questions either from those of you in the room or those of you watching virtually. You can tweet your questions to hashtag SSI events. Do we have any questions here in the room to begin with? Yes, please.
I'm Craig McKenna, faculty member here.
Craig, could I ask you to use the microphone, please, so we can record the questions? Thank you.
I got it. I can do that. Never confront a faculty member with this modern technology stuff. I was waiting for you to say something about the refugee problem, and you didn't. And I wonder why that is. That's my question. It seems to me to be a major security challenge for Europe and the European Union. Major. We can talk about Donbass and all these conventional security issues, but this is destabilizing in a lot of ways. It's destabilizing politically, I would say much more than Russian hacking. There's a steady toll of lives. This morning's newspaper, 77 bodies washed up again. It's ongoing. It's led to closure of borders, sort of cat and mouse game with Schengen. It looks a lot like a very serious security challenge, which the European Union is having a very difficult time coming to terms with. Am I right in saying that? And if so, why?
Definitely right that we're having a lot of difficulty coming to grips with it. But I don't see it as a security challenge, and I think most people in the system don't see it as a security challenge. So I didn't address it because I was talking, let's say, about the political-military side of the spectrum, and I don't consider the refugee crisis to be a part of that. It's obviously a security problem for the refugees, and you're very right to point out the loss of life there. I do think, though, that because of the deal that was made with Turkey, as Herman Van Rompuy, the previous president of the European Council, said, it's not a deal that will win any beauty pageant, but it was probably a necessary thing to do. That seen from the EU point of view, it's gotten under control. It's gotten contained. The difficulty now will be to stabilize Libya, because Libya has more governments than Belgium now, and that's not a good thing. I can tell you that. And is unwilling to allow any foreign boots on the ground, even to allow ships in its territorial waters. So You can't really stop the Libyan route still, and that's an issue. Of course, in the longer run, we'll have to address the root causes, and the debate in Europe has sadly mostly been about stopping people or what to do with refugees once they are in Europe, and not about the root causes. And the main reason that opened the floodgates is the war in Syria. Simple as, well, it's as simple as that. And when the war in Syria will peter out, then we will be able to manage it, because it's then when that creates such a massive stream, that also lots of people in other parts of the world say, the door is open, so now is the chance. And that, for example, we saw the refugee stream from Afghanistan pick up again, which had been more or less, which had more or less ended. I would not overestimate the threat to Schengen. Indeed, there is much more limited free travel than before if you're not an EU citizen, right? But if you're an EU citizen, which I am, and as John knows, I travel all the time for work, you don't notice anything about the so-called end of Schengen. I just still go anywhere where I want, often without having to show my ID, passing from my ideas I try to show, but my ID from country to country.
Yes, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
I think so.
Okay, thanks. So Stephanie Ahern, thank you so much for coming. I wanted to ask the question as a follow-up. You said that some of the countries within NATO were unwilling to deploy forces. Would you mind just talking a little bit more on what you mean on that?
Well, some spend more on defense than others, but those are not necessarily the same ones who are the most willing to deploy troops. And it's actually, some of the smaller countries have been quite good. I mean, all things in proportion, of course, to take part in operations. They were in Libya, they are now in above Libya, above Syria and Iraq, for example. Whereas others of the mid-sized European countries that proportionally they do a lot less. So just to focus on the 2% only is not necessarily helpful. That's why I say that. I'm not trying to find excuses for not reaching the 2%, even though I do think we shouldn't. The question for me is not how much of your GDP do you spend on defense, because anyway your GDP, that's an artificial thing also, right? If you're in an economic crisis and your GDP shrinks, but your defense budget stays steady, and all of a sudden you're getting towards the 2% by doing nothing. So it is a very artificial measure. My question is, what is our military level of ambition? What is it that we need to be able to do, and which force package does that require, including which deployable force package? What I think we need, and there is a gap in European strategic thinking. The EU global strategy clearly says strategic autonomy, including in military terms, meaning that there are a number of tasks that, if necessary, Europeans need to be able to do alone. That does not include Article 5, that's NATO. But everything below that threshold, there are certain things that we ought to be able to do alone, not for the fun of doing them alone, but because it may be necessary. So politically, that statement is there. But then member states so far have not been willing to open that military discussion. Say, okay, what military force does that require then, and how are we going to get to that? And I think to express it in terms of force package, in my view, would be a lot more useful than to refer to the 2%.
Right.
But,
so
go ahead.
As I say, just as a follow-up, why are the countries not? Is it that the missions that they don't agree with? Is that they're more focused on internal missions? Or I'm just wondering, so take aside the 2%, but why are the countries that are part of NATO not willing to deploy their forces?
Why are they not willing to deploy force? For a variety of reasons. It's often just domestic politics. Some because they fear Turkey rather than anything else. There's a whole series. Some because the strategic cultures of the 28 European EU member states are very different, and for some, I often joke that some governments seem to be willing to deploy the troops only if they really promise not to hurt anybody. No, that may be the right attitude in some cases, but in other cases it isn't. So it's an issue, I think, it's a very broad answer, but I would say it's an issue of strategic culture. How do you see the utility and the legitimacy of the use of force? Overall, I think we put a higher threshold on the use of force than you here in the United States. But within Europe, it's also pretty uneven. And that explains that great difference in willingness to actually deploy forces for, let's say, non-Article 5 expeditionary operations.
If I could add to that, I couldn't agree with you more on the arbitrary nature of the 2% goal. And frankly, it's the lack of utility in reflecting what the Allies bring to the table. The poster children for this are really Greece and Denmark, right? As you were hinting at regarding defending against Turkey, the Greeks routinely have spent more than 2% of their GDP, or the equivalent of 2% of their GDP, on defense. And yet, relative to many other allies, they've not deployed as much or taken on as much risk as many other allies. And you contrast that with Denmark, which has spent somewhere around 1.4, 1.5% over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years, routinely regularly under the 2% goal. And so you'd think, oh, they're the slackers. But no, in fact, as many of you may know in uniform, that they take on greater risk downrange in places like Afghanistan, and I think had the second or third highest casualty rate in Afghanistan. And so the 2% thing is really not terribly useful, certainly not in a vacuum. Yes, please, Mike.
One other thing you didn't mention was the wave of Islamic or jihadist terrorism in Europe. And I know it's a complicated topic worthy of another couple of hours, but I'm thinking about it in terms of some of the things that you brought up. It could complicate, of course, states getting to 2%, because money spent on external defense is less money one can spend on intel or gendarmerie or whatever one wants to do. It also renders absolutely useless the concept of buffer states, it seems to me. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about how you see that phenomenon impacting both defense spending and how the EU as an institution, as opposed to individual member states, are approaching the problem. In other words, is the EU moving towards a collective understanding of a problem that's affecting all those states, or is it still understood to be a policing function internal to those states?
You're certainly right that it has an impact on defense spending, because there's obviously a strong push to put domestic security first. And you see that if there are additional means available, they tend to go to police or paramilitary forces, or to deploying the military, but in your own streets. Very sizable operations in France and also in Belgium, given the size of our force. Not necessarily the most useful use of troops, and I think in the Belgian case, we ought to end that deployment, because it's a waste of resource. You don't need paratroopers to stand outside the U.S. Embassy in Brussels. They can be better used in Mali, for example, or in the Central African Republic. But it is true that tends to divert the means if there are additional means in the broad security sphere. I entirely agree with that. For sure, there's no such thing as buffer state when it comes to that. Though there is an external link, of course, in the sense of I think it would be too far to call an ideology, but a certain idea and the atmosphere of ISIS and what goes on in Syria and Iraq that serves to inspire people. Once you take out ISIS as an entity that controls a territory, that idea will still be there, but then it will peter out also. We've seen the same happen after Al-Qaeda was destroyed as a sort of centralized organization run out of Afghanistan. So it will peter out, but it will take time. Meanwhile, that's on the one hand an issue for the police and the justice apparatus. So it's primarily a member state thing, which is backed up by EU-level exchange of information. And I understand, partially I didn't mention because Division of Labor, there's another guy at our institute who does terrorism, who writes on terrorism. And I understand a well-performing, on terrorism specifically, a well-performing network of exchange of information, of which the US is a part, actually. So that seems to function. But of course, there is no zero threat. You will always find a soft target, unfortunately. The other question is, what is wrong in our society that so many people felt sufficiently alienated to think that to go and fight and often die in Syria for IS would be a better option, right? Before you make that choice, you have to have some seriously flawed view or feel seriously alienated from Belgium, for example, if you're a Belgian citizen. So that means that there's a longer term effort to make in terms of promoting equality within our own societies, making sure that equality applies to everybody, including people from immigrant backgrounds whose chances are more limited. So there is no one reason, one explanation fits all for this, but most research seems to indicate it's definitely not a religious thing. And it's partially, in every society you have a number of people who turn to violence, and some of the types who have now joined ISIS because the option is there. If they hadn't done that, they would have become they would have committed armed robberies and the like, because that's just that streak of society that you have everywhere, and there's now another option for them available. So those people you always have, but you can do a lot, I think, by giving people more prospects in society to reduce the breeding ground for extremism.
Yes, please, Joel.
Yeah, thank you for your thought-provoking comments so far. I did want to ask a question though about economics in the economic union portion of the European Union. In Maastricht, with the old three pillars, the economics, the common security, and the internal affairs, it seems to me it really never really was a pillar, but the foundation of the European Union, and maybe that foundation is still a little weak. I know the EU has moved towards closer to a banking union, but if we were to have another debt crisis, not in Greece, but in Italy or some of the bigger economies, has the EU done enough to address these economic issues so it can be a strategic, autonomous act?
I would say not yet, that it needs to move further. I mean, it did go, if you compare the degree of integration in a number of sectors today with where we were in 2008, before the crisis, enormous leaps have been made. I mean, today, as a member of the Eurozone, you cannot enact your national budget until after it's been approved by the Commission. That goes very far, right? It means your entire national budget, that includes your defense budget. First send it to Brussels. It has to be approved by the Commission. There have been improvements made, as you said, on the banking union, though experts doubt whether it really goes far enough. But I think the next leap would be, on the one hand, more fiscal harmonization to make sure that member states don't compete with each other by offering the lowest taxes, because that in the end doesn't benefit anybody. And I would add to that a certain degree of social harmonization, where on the one hand you avoid social dumping, right? You avoid that a Bulgarian takes a job in Belgium, and even though he's living in Belgium, but officially he's still living in Bulgaria, so you can pay him a very low Bulgarian salary, and he drives someone in Belgium with a Belgian salary out of the market, because again that leads to a downward spiral which doesn't benefit anybody. There are very good ideas out there how also at the EU level could sort of have a second level insurance of welfare policies, in the sense that if a member state would get into trouble and would find it difficult to continue funding its welfare system, the EU could step in and act as a second level funder of the welfare system. Why? Because we've seen that, for example, in the case of Greece, if you force austerity measures upon a country, but therefore they also have to dismantle the welfare system, you actually make things worse. Because in countries where the welfare system is stronger in Europe, so those who spend the most on social security have been hit the least by the crisis. Why? Because that creates a buffer, that creates a mechanism that protects people's spending power. And so they've also suffered, but far less than those where social security was much less. There are very good ideas in the Commission on all of those topics, but the question is to find now the critical mass of member states that want to go ahead with this. And in this regard, who will be the next French president and the next German chancellor will be crucial to make it happen.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've run out of time here. I want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank our virtual audience as well. If you came in late, you should all know we've recorded this event. We'll be posting this in the days to come at the SSI's website, specifically on the media page. So I'd invite you to take a look there if you wanted to catch the entire event and were unable to. Before we go, though, please join me in thanking Dr. Sven Biskop for joining us today. Thank you.